Okay, I'm here to talk to you about the development of the Gospels, otherwise known as the Introduction to the New Testament or Christian Scriptures. This phrase that I have on this first slide, the good news is not the daily news. We're going to come back to that phrase a little bit later. I just want you to kind of keep it in mind during these first slides. Please remember that there is an incomplete outline that can be found on the Edline calendar, and you are going to want to use that as you go to fill in the important words as we go along. Also remember there will be a journal, so you should have that handy as well. Here we go. So as we transition from the Hebrew to the Christian Scriptures, we can remember that the Hebrew word for covenant can be translated as testament. So while the Hebrew Scriptures share the story of the covenant of God and God's chosen people, the Christian Scriptures share a new covenant through Jesus Christ. This covenant continues and fulfills the old. It does not replace or contradict it. So we're going to be moving forward and yet connecting back to the Hebrew Scriptures through our study. So what is a gospel? Well, it has many meanings. It is the English word for good news, and it can either refer to the message of Jesus, so there would be just one gospel in that case, or a book in the New Testament that tells of that message. So there are 4 gospels. Think about this for a moment. If the word gospel means good news, how might that influence the way that you read the text? Perhaps I could invite you to be excited when you open the Bible, when you read these stories of Jesus' life, referred to as good news. Also, something to consider is that there's a lot of suffering and eventually even the death of Jesus recorded in these Gospels. So why would we call it good news if some of it involves suffering? I want you to keep that in the back of your mind because we're going to be talking a lot about suffering in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll come to an answer for that question. There are several stages in the development of the New Testament, and the first is the life experiences of Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus' disciples. Now, there are lots of things we learn about Jesus. He was a Jew, a carpenter, a worker of wonders, born somewhere around 4 to 6 BCE, who gathered followers around him. He attracted a lot of attention, some of it positive, some of it negative. His hometown was Nazareth. He preached about the kingdom of God and was crucified by the Romans in Jerusalem. So before the Gospels can be written, the events have to happen. And so, once these events occur, we experience a pivotal event. And you have to say it that way because it's very important and exciting. A pivotal event is an event that dramatically changes a situation or a person, and it brings about transformation. You're able to see a clear distinction before and after a pivotal event. So, for example, Ignatius has a pivotal event when he's wounded at Pamplona and recovers at Loyola, and he totally changes and transforms his life as a result of that event. In the Bible, an example of a pivotal event is the resurrection. The disciples' experience of the resurrection transforms them. It transforms their understanding of Jesus' identity, verifying Jesus is the Lord. It transforms their willingness to witness to him, their relationship with him. It brings their fear into courage, their doubt into conviction. So now, I invite you to turn to the journal section of your iPad or notebook, and I invite you to complete the Pivotal Event Journal. Remember, a pivotal event was just defined as an event that dramatically changes a situation or person. It's something that brings about transformation. And so the question is, have you experienced a pivotal event in your life? If so, describe the experience. And if not, describe the pivotal moment of another person or character you've encountered. So please pause this video now and complete the pivotal event journal. Welcome back. As we move forward from the pivotal event journal, we move into the next step in the development of the New Testament, oral tradition, the disciples in the early community of faith. Now, the disciples experienced a sense of urgency in telling this story. They wanted to spread the good news of the resurrection quickly so that many more people could experience this joy. Think about when you have good news. You want to tell everyone as quickly as possible. So they began oral tradition, and they chose the words and deeds of Jesus to remember and pass on to the various peoples throughout the Mediterranean area. Now, it is very important to remember, what is it that the disciples remember as they tell this story? Not everything. They remember the lessons from Jesus' teachings that were most important to the context of their experiences at that time. So they were instructing people who wanted to enter the community. They were trying to live out Jesus' message and trying to connect his life to the prophecies of the Jewish Bible or Hebrew Scriptures as those became part of worship services. So earlier, when I said that we should remember the good news is not the daily news, we should remember that the Gospels are not newspapers. There weren't people following Jesus around and writing down what he said as he said it. Rather, they're picking and choosing what to pass on through oral tradition. So what they're saying is not exact, it's not complete, it's not carefully documented facts. Rather, they're choosing the most important events, the most memorable words, and the most applicable teachings to pass on. The third stage is the written stage of development. They write it down. And the reason they do this is because the second coming of Jesus was delayed. They thought Jesus was returning quickly, and so they thought they needed to tell everyone as fast as possible. But now it's been a while, and our eyewitnesses are starting to die off, and they think, wow, we need to preserve this information so we can pass it on to future generations to inspire and instruct believers. So they start writing down, again, not everything, but the stuff that seemed most important to them in their time period. How did they write this down? The letters were written before the Gospels. So even though they're found farther back in the Bible, they were actually written before the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not necessarily written by their namesakes, meaning Matthew didn't necessarily write the Gospel of Matthew, nor Mark the Gospel of Mark, just like Moses didn't write the entire Torah. We assign these books these names mostly out of tradition, but as you'll see in the introduction to each Gospel, we don't really know who exactly wrote these texts, though we can discern some information about approximately when and where they might have been written based on some of the events that we find within those texts. The first gospel written is Mark, and it's going to be the first gospel that we read. There's also a source called Q, and Q is the name given to some written material about the life and teachings of Jesus that was available to the authors of Matthew and Luke, but not to the author of Mark. It's called Q because Q is the first letter of the German word Quelle, which means source. And Q was first hypothesized by a group of German theologians, as I'll explain in this next slide. If it had been figured out by Americans, they probably would have called it S for source. But since it was German, they call it Q for Quelle. Source criticism is discovering the source of materials the authors used to construct their Gospels. So they didn't have MLA format, they didn't have a works cited page. So theologians try to take the final work of these Gospels and then figure out where they got their sources from. And this leads us to the two-source hypothesis, or some call it the modified two-source hypothesis. I'm only going to speak about this briefly here, and we're going to really talk about it in more depth in class. But just to give you an idea, this two-source hypothesis came across from realizing that there were some identical passages in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that were not found in the Gospel of Mark. And so, theologians determined there must have been a source available to Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, which is called Q. You'll notice the line from Q to Matthew and Q to Luke represents this. They also found passages in Matthew and Luke that were verbatim passages from Mark, which you see represented by the line from Mark to Matthew and Matthew to Luke. We don't believe Matthew and Luke had any interaction with each other. So by finding these identical passages that we also see in Mark, that's how we determine that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke probably had a copy of Mark, and the fact that they had these other resources that didn't come from Mark. If Matthew and Luke didn't have any interaction with each other, and these weren't found in Mark, that's how they came up with the concept of Q. Furthermore, Matthew has some stuff in his gospel that is unique to Matthew, and we refer to that as M, Matthew's unique sources, which you see the arrow pointing to Matthew. Luke also has his own unique sources found only in Luke, which are represented by L, which has the arrow pointing from L to Luke. The way that the arrow is pointing shows where the source is coming from and going to. Now, where is God in all of this? Well, this whole hypothesis presumes a willingness to see the everyday process of telling a story and copying a text as possible vehicles by which God brings about that which he wishes to accomplish. In other words, it's saying that the process in which the final product was put together, the contributions from these sources, we believe that God is working through this process to inspire the writers. The Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means seen together or same eye, and it's a term used for the three Gospels that have many passages almost word for word in common. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels. And while there are differences among these texts, and many differences compared to John, all of the texts contain a passion narrative. The passion narrative is a fancy name given to the stories of Jesus' suffering and death. A passion narrative is found in all four Gospels, which shows us that it's very important. The fourth stage, edited and collected. This is where we see the influence of redaction criticism. This sees the authors as editors. By looking at the way the authors assembled their Gospels, what they said, what they left out, how they said it, in order to determine their theology and how the needs of the audience shaped each of their final works. For example, each of the Gospels gives us different images of Jesus, and while each Gospel has multiple images of Jesus, here are some of the main images of Jesus. Mark speaks of Jesus as the suffering servant we saw in 2 Isaiah. Matthew sees Jesus as the Jewish Messiah that has been foretold. Luke sees Jesus as the compassionate and universal Savior, here for everyone. And John sees Jesus as the divine Son of God. The reason we have four versions of the life of Christ is because each gospel was written by a different person or people for a different community with different needs and struggles. And it shows us, rather than having one gospel, the diversity of gospels shows us that just like God is always more, there's always more we can be learning about Jesus. And just like if I asked multiple people in your life to tell me about you, and each person might tell different stories, so too each gospel gives us a little bit different image of Jesus. We're going to stop here. You'll notice the notes go on, and I will continue this presentation in the next class. Thank you for listening, and have a good evening, or afternoon, whenever you're listening.